in the unforgiving landscape of the Old West, where survival meant looking out for yourself and trust was a luxury few could afford. One man's simple act of compassion would forever change the course of his life. Jacob "Jake" Morrison was a poor cowboy, weathered by years of hard labor and disappointment, scraping by on the edges of civilization with nothing but his horse, his rifle, and his worn-out dreams. But on one fateful evening, when he found a wounded Indigenous boy bleeding in the dust, Jake made a choice that defied every rule of the frontier. He didn't know the boy's name, didn't speak his language, and had no reason to risk his own safety. Yet something in those desperate eyes spoke to the humanity Jake thought he'd lost long ago. As dawn broke the next morning, Jake awoke to a sight that would make any man's heart stop. 150 native warriors surrounding his modest camp, weapons in hand, their faces painted for war. What Jake couldn't have known was that the boy he saved was no ordinary child, and the debt of honor he'd unknowingly earned would reveal a truth about courage, loyalty, and the invisible threads that connect all people, regardless of the color of their skin or the language they speak. The sun hung low over the Texas plains, like a blood-red eye watching the world with indifference, casting long shadows across the scrubland where Jacob Morrison guided his aging mare through the dusty trail. At 43 years old, Jake had the kind of face that told stories without words, deep lines carved by sun and sorrow, eyes that had seen too much and hoped for too little, and hands calloused from decades of ranch work that barely kept him fed. He'd once been a man of ambition, dreaming of his own spread of land, a family, maybe even prosperity. But the West had a way of grinding down such dreams into dust as fine as the powder that coated his boots. His wife had died of fever 7 years ago. His daughter had moved east with relatives who could actually provide for her, and the ranch he'd worked for had gone under when the drought hit. Now he drifted from job to job, town to town, always one bad season away from starvation, always alone. The year was 1872, and tensions between settlers and the indigenous tribes had reached a boiling point across the frontier. The government's promises had proven as empty as a dried-up creek bed, and the native peoples who had lived on these lands for countless generations were being systematically pushed from their ancestral territories. Raids and counter-raids had become routine, with atrocities committed on both sides, fueling an endless cycle of violence and revenge. Jake tried to stay out of it all. He had no quarrel with the indigenous people, saw them as human beings just trying to survive like everyone else, but he also knew that expressing such views in most frontier towns could get a man labeled as a sympathizer or worse. So he kept his head down, did his work, and tried not to think too hard about the injustice of it all. On this particular evening, Jake was making his way toward the small settlement of Broken Creek, where he'd heard a rancher named Patterson might be hiring hands for the cattle drive north. The journey should have taken 2 days, but Jake had wandered off the main trail to avoid a group of rough-looking men he'd spotted earlier, the kind of men who might decide a lone cowboy would be easy pickings. The detour had cost him time, and now darkness was approaching faster than he'd anticipated. He began scanning the landscape for a suitable place to make camp, somewhere with water if possible, shelter from the wind if he was lucky. That as when he heard it, a sound so faint he almost missed it beneath the whisper of wind through the sagebrush. It was a whimper, weak and pain-filled, coming from somewhere off to his left near a cluster of rocks. Jake's first instinct was to ignore it, to keep riding and mind his own business. The frontier had taught him that getting involved in other people's troubles was a fast way to end up dead. But something about the sound tugged at him, reminding him of the way his daughter used to cry when she'd hurt herself as a child. With a resigned sigh, he turned his mare toward the rocks, his hand instinctively moving to rest on the rifle hanging from a saddle. What he found among the rocks made his breath catch in his throat. A young boy, no more than 13 or 14 years old, lay sprawled on the ground in a spreading pool of his own blood. The child was indigenous, That much was immediately clear from his clothing and the long black hair matted with dirt and gore. A deep gash ran along his side, and what looked like a bullet wound marked his shoulder. His eyes were half closed, his breathing shallow and rapid. Around his neck hung a distinctive necklace made of intricate beadwork and patterns Jake had never seen before, with what appeared to be eagle feathers and small carved stones worked into the design. Jake dismounted quickly, his practical nature taking over despite the warning bells going off in his head. This was trouble, pure and simple. If anyone found him helping an Indigenous boy, especially one who'd clearly been shot, he could be accused of collaborating with the enemy. In the current climate, that could mean a noose or a bullet, no questions asked. But as he knelt beside the boy and saw the fear and pain in those dark eyes, Jake found he couldn't walk away. The boy tried to speak, words in a language Jake didn't understand, his voice barely above a whisper. "Easy there, son," Jake said softly, knowing the boy probably couldn't understand him either, but hoping his tone might convey his intentions. "I'm not gonna hurt you. Let me take a look at those wounds." He carefully examined the injuries. The bullet had passed through the shoulder, which was lucky, but the gash along the ribs was deep and still bleeding. The boy must have been running from something or someone, and had either been shot or had fallen onto something sharp during his escape. Without immediate treatment, the child would bleed out before midnight. Jake worked quickly, tearing strips from his spare shirt to create bandages. He cleaned the wounds as best he could with water from his canteen, then applied pressure to slow the bleeding. The boy cried out in pain but didn't try to fight him off, which Jake took as a sign that some part of him understood he was being helped. As he worked, Jake found himself talking to the boy in a low, steady voice, the same way he used to talk to his daughter when she was frightened. "You're gonna be all right. You hear me? I've patched up worse than this. Had a friend who took an arrow clean through his leg, and he was dancing at a barn raising 2 months later. You're young. You're strong. You'll heal up just fine." Once he'd done what he could for the wounds, Jake faced his next dilemma. The boy couldn't stay here. If whoever had shot him came looking, they'd finish the job. But taking him along was dangerous for both of them. Jake sat back on his heels, studying the child's face, seeing the trust that was starting to replace the fear in his eyes. That look decided it for him. He couldn't leave the boy to die, no matter what the cost might be. "All right then," he said, more to himself than to his patient. "Looks like you're coming with me." Getting the boy onto his horse was a challenge. The child was weak from blood. Loss in each movement brought fresh waves of pain, but somehow they managed it. Jake fashioned a makeshift support to keep the boy from falling, then swung up behind him, holding him steady as they began a slow journey toward a spot Jake remembered from his wandering days. There was a small cave about 3 miles north, hidden among a tumble of boulders and overgrown with scrub brush. It wasn't much, but it would provide shelter and concealment while the boy recovered enough to what? Jake hadn't thought that far ahead. He couldn't take him to Broken Creek. The townsfolk would likely lynch them both. He couldn't turn him over to the army, who'd probably stick him in a reservation regardless of where he came from. The only option was to help him heal and then somehow return him to his people, though Jake had no idea how he'd accomplish that without getting himself killed in the process. The ride to the cave took longer than expected, with Jake having to stop twice when the boy's wounds started bleeding through the bandages again. By the time they arrived, full darkness had fallen and a cold wind had picked up, carrying with it the smell of distant rain. Jake helped the boy down from the horse and half carried him into the shallow cave, then went about making a small, sheltered fire that wouldn't be visible from a distance. He had some dried beef and hardtack in his saddlebags, and he managed to get the boy to eat a little and drink some water, though it was clear that every swallow was an effort. As the night deepened and the fire crackled softly between them, Jake found himself studying the boy more closely. There was something about him that suggested he wasn't just any child. the quality of his clothing, the elaborate necklace, the way he carried himself even in his weakened state, all spoke of someone important. Jake wondered if maybe he was the son of a chief or a medicine man, someone whose absence would be noticed and whose fate would matter to his people. The thought made him uneasy. If he'd inadvertently taken someone important, the consequences could be even more severe than he'd imagined. The boy's eyes remained open, watching Jake with an intensity that was somehow both unsettling and reassuring. Despite the language barrier, something unspoken passed between them, a recognition of shared humanity, perhaps, or simply the universal language of one person caring for another in a time of need. Jake settled back against the cave wall, his rifle close at hand, and prepared for a long, watchful night. He had no way of knowing that this simple act of compassion had set in motion a chain of events that would challenge everything he thought he knew about. Honor, loyalty, and the invisible bonds that could form between peoples who seemed to have nothing in common but their humanity. Dawn broke cold and gray, with fingers of mist creeping through the scrubland like ghostly serpents. Jake had barely slept, jerking awake at every sound, his hand flying to his rifle at the snap of a twig or the cry of a distant coyote. The boy had passed a difficult night, fevered and restless, occasionally crying out in his sleep, in words Jake couldn't understand but whose pain transcended language. Twice Jake had to change the bandages when fresh blood seeped through, and by morning he was genuinely worried that infection might be setting in despite his best efforts. He knew his limitations. He was a cowboy, not a doctor, and what he knew about treating wounds came from hard experience and watching ranch hands patch each other up after accidents. The boy needed real medical attention, but Jake had no idea how to provide it without putting them both at risk. As pale sunlight began filtering into the cave, the boy's fever seemed to break slightly, and his eyes opened with more clarity than they'd shown the night before. He looked at Jake with an expression that combined gratitude, curiosity, and something else, a kind of assessment, as if he were taking the measure of the man who'd saved him. Then, to Jake's surprise, the boy spoke in halting but recognizable English. "You help me." "Why?" His voice was weak, each word clearly an effort, but the fact that he could communicate at all sent a wave of relief through Jake. "You speak English," Jake said, unable to hide his surprise. "Where'd you learn that?" The boy's lips twitched in what might have been an attempt at a smile. "Mission school. 3 winters. Before ... quotes." He paused, his face clouding with pain that seemed emotional rather than physical. "Before they came. Before they burned." Jake felt his stomach tighten. He'd heard stories about the mission schools, some good, but many terrible places where indigenous children were taken to be civilized, often by force, where they were forbidden to speak their own languages or practice their traditions. But he'd also heard about raids on these schools, settlers or soldiers burning them out, sometimes with the children still inside. "I'm sorry," he said simply, not knowing what else to say. The boy studied him for a long moment, then seemed to come to some decision. "I am running, dear," he said carefully, as if the English name was one he'd chosen himself rather than one that had been given to him. "My father..." "He's ... quotes." The boy struggled with the word, then said something in his own language that sounded like soaring eagle. Then he touched the elaborate necklace around his throat and added, "Chief, war chief." "Of the Numanu." Jake recognized the word. It's what the Comanche called themselves, the people. The information hit Jake like a physical blow. He'd saved the son of a Comanche war chief. The Comanche were legendary warriors, feared across the plains for their riding skills and fierce defense of their territory. They'd been fighting a desperate war against encroachment for decades, and the violence had escalated dramatically in recent years. And here Jake was, hiding the wounded son of one of their leaders in a cave, with no plan and no idea how to return him safely to his people. "Jesus," Jake muttered, running a hand through his graying hair. "Your father." He must be looking for you. Running Deer's expression grew troubled. We were hunting, far from camp. Bad men came, white men with guns. They shot first, no talking. My cousin, Grey Wolf, he double Coy's voice. Broken tears welled in his eyes. They killed him, shot him from his horse. I ran. They chased. I fell, hurt myself on rocks. I thought they would find me, kill me like Grey Wolf. Jake felt a familiar anger rising in his chest, the same anger he'd felt countless times when hearing about senseless violence on the frontier. These men who attacked you, did you see what they looked like? Were they soldiers? Running Deer shook his head. No blue coats, just men, bad men. One had mark on face. He traced a line down his cheek, like lightning, a scar. That wasn't much to go on, but Jake filed the information away. Probably buffalo hunters or the kind of drifters who saw killing indigenous people as sport rather than crime. In the current atmosphere, they'd likely never face justice for what they'd done. The thought made him sick, but there was nothing he could do about it now except focus on keeping Running Deer alive and finding a way to return him to his people. Over the next few hours, as the sun climbed higher and warmed the air slightly, Jake worked on improving their shelter and tending to Running Deer's wounds. The boy seemed stronger now that the fever had broken, though he was still far too weak to travel. They communicated in a mix of English and gestures, with Running Deer teaching Jake a few basic words in Comanche and Jake sharing stories about his life to pass the time and distract the boy from his pain. Jake found himself talking about things he hadn't discussed in years. His late wife Martha, his daughter Sarah, the dreams he'd once had for a better life. Running Deer listened intently, then shared his own stories. He spoke of his father, Soaring Eagle, a wise and respected leader who had been trying to find a path that would allow his people to survive in a world that seemed determined to destroy them. He talked about his mother, Bright Morning, who had died of the white man's diseases 2 winters ago, joining the countless other indigenous people who had fallen to smallpox and cholera. He described his tribe's summer camps, the buffalo hunts, the ceremonies and traditions that connected them to the land and to each other. As he spoke, Jake began to see past the propaganda and prejudice he'd absorbed from frontier culture, recognizing instead a rich and complex civilization that was being systematically erased. "Your father," Jake asked carefully, "what will he do when he finds you're missing?" Running Deer's eyes grew distant. "He will search. He will send warriors to find me. And if he finds ... The boy paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "If he finds I was killed by white men, there will be war. Real war. Not just raids. He has been holding back, trying to make peace, trying to find a way for our people to live. But if I am dead ... He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. Jake understood. The death of a war chief's son would be the final straw, the thing that would tip the scales from uneasy coexistence to all-out conflict. The weight of this knowledge settled on Jake's shoulders like a physical burden. He wasn't just responsible for one boy's life. He was potentially holding in his hands the key to war or peace for the entire region. If Running Deer died, or if his rescue was mishandled, countless people would suffer the consequences. Jake had never wanted to be important, had never sought out responsibility beyond his own survival, and now he found himself at the center of something much larger than himself. As afternoon shadows lengthened, Jake made a decision. "We need to get word to your father," he said. "Need to let him know you're alive and safe. But I can't just ride into Comanche territory. I'd be dead before I could explain myself. And I can't take you to any settlement. Is there ... Is there anywhere we could meet? Somewhere your people might look for you?" Running Deer considered this for a long moment. Then his eyes lit up with recognition. "The Painted Rocks," he said. 3 days' ride north and west. Sacred place. My people, we go there sometimes. Leave signs, messages. If I could leave sign there, my father would know. It was risky, but it was the best option they had. Jake would need to keep running deer hidden here while he made the journey to these painted rocks, wherever they were, and somehow leave a message that would be found and understood. The plan had about 100 ways it could go wrong, but doing nothing was an even worse option. "All right," Jake said. "But first, you need to rest and get stronger. And you need to teach me enough of your language that I can at least say, 'I have your son,' without getting myself killed." For the first time since Jake had found him, Running Deer actually smiled, a real smile that transformed his young face and reminded Jake of Sarah at that age. "I teach you," the boy said. "But you ... He paused, struggling for words, then said something in Comanche and gestured as if asking for Jake's name. "Jake," he answered. "Jake Morrison. Though I suppose I should give you a proper name." He thought for a moment, then remembered the Comanche tradition of descriptive names. "Ironhard," he tried, in his terrible Comanche pronunciation, pointing to himself. Running Deer laughed, actually laughed, then shook his head and said something that Jake eventually understood to mean, "No. You are friend who stands against the wind." It was clumsy in translation, but Jake understood the sentiment. He was a man who stood his ground when the easier path would be to turn away. As night fell again, and Jake prepared their meager dinner over the small fire, he found himself thinking about the strange turns life could take. 24 hours ago, he'd been a lonely, purposeless drifter with nothing but his next meal and his next job on his mind. Now he was hiding a Comanche war chief's son in a cave, planning to ride into potentially hostile territory and somehow becoming responsible for preventing a war. It was terrifying and absurd and completely insane. But as he watched Running Deer carefully eat the food he'd prepared, seeing the trust and hope in the boy's eyes, Jake realized something important. For the first time in years, he felt like his life actually mattered. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was making a difference, however small, however dangerous. And that feeling, he discovered, was worth any risk. The third morning in the cave brought an event that would change everything. Jake had risen before dawn, as was his habit, and was preparing to scout the area and hunt for fresh meat running. Deer needed better food than hardtack and dried beef if he was going to recover his strength. The boy was sleeping peacefully, his wounds finally beginning to show signs of healing, the fever completely gone. Jake had just saddled his Mari and was about to ride out when he heard something that made his blood run cold. The sound of many horses moving through the scrubland, accompanied by the soft jingle of weapons and gear. Jake's first instinct was to run, to get back to the cave and prepare to defend Running Deer or die trying. But reason held him back. If he rushed toward the cave, he might lead whoever was out there directly to their hiding place. Instead, he quickly tied his horse behind a large boulder and crept forward to a vantage point where he could observe without being seen. What he saw made his heart hammer in his chest with a terror unlike anything he'd experienced in years of dangerous living. Warriors, dozens of them, maybe more than 100, moving in a loose but coordinated search pattern across the landscape. They were Comanche, Jake could tell from their horses, their weapons, their manner of dress. They moved with the fluid grace of men who had been born on horseback, every sense alert, clearly searching for something or someone. At their head rode a man who could only be soaring eagle-tall and commanding even among warriors, his face a mask of controlled fury and desperate worry. The war chief's presence radiated authority and barely contained violence, and Jake understood with sudden, terrible clarity that these men would kill anyone they thought had harmed Running Deer without a moment's hesitation. Jake's mind raced through his options, none of them good. He could hide and hope they passed by without finding the cave. But the Comanche were legendary trackers. They would find his campsite eventually, probably within hours. He could try to slip away and abandon Running Deer, but the thought was immediately rejected. He couldn't do that after coming this far. That left one option, possibly the most dangerous thing he'd ever considered in his life. He could reveal himself and try to communicate his peaceful intentions before they decided he was a threat and filled him with arrows. The decision was made for him when one of the warriors, a young man with alert eyes, suddenly pointed in the direction of the cave. He'd spotted something, probably the faint traces of smoke from Jake's carefully hidden fire, or maybe tracks that Jake had missed in his efforts to cover their presence. The warrior called out to Soaring Eagle, and several others began moving toward the area where Running Deer lay hidden and helpless. Jake didn't give himself time to think about what he was doing. He stepped out from behind his cover, his hands raised high in the universal gesture of peace, his rifle deliberately left behind. "I have your son," he called out in his terrible Comanche, hoping he was using the right words. "Running Deer lives. I help him. I friend." The reaction was instantaneous and terrifying. Every weapon in the war party suddenly pointed at Jake, bows drawn, rifles raised, spears leveled. Soaring Eagle wheeled his magnificent painted horse and fixed Jake with a stare that felt like it could bore holes through solid rock. The war chief's hand was on his weapon, his face a mixture of hope, fury, and suspicion. He said something sharp in Comanche, too fast and complex for Jake to follow, then seemed to realize the white man might not understand and switched to broken English. Where's my son? What you do to him?" "He's alive," Jake said, trying to keep his voice steady, despite the fact that he was seconds away from death if he said the wrong thing. "He was shot, wounded. I found him 3 days ago. I've been caring for him, helping him heal. He's in a cave, not far from here. He's weak, but he's going to be okay." Jake gestured carefully toward the direction of the cave, making sure his movements were slow and non-threatening. Soaring Eagle said something to the warriors around him, and 4 of them immediately dismounted and began moving toward where Jake had indicated, weapons still at the ready. The war chief himself rode closer to Jake, circling him slowly on his horse, studying him with eyes that seemed to see everything. The exhaustion on Jake's face, the lack of weapons, the sincerity in his expression. "Why?" Soaring Eagle finally asked, the single word carrying the weight of deep suspicion. "Why white man help Numanu boy?" Jake met his eyes, refusing to look away despite the fear hammering in his chest. "Because he needed help," he said simply. "Because he's a child and he was dying. Because ... He struggled to find words that would bridge the vast cultural divide between them, because it was the right thing to do. The only thing to do. For a long moment, Soaring Eagle said nothing, just continued to study Jake as if trying to read the truth in his very soul. Then one of the warriors who had gone to the cave called out, his voice carrying a note of relief and excitement. Moments later, they emerged, helping Running Deer walk between them, the boy weak but clearly alive. When Running Deer saw his father, his stoic composure broke, and tears streamed down his young face as he called out, "Father," in Comanche. Soaring Eagle dismounted in one fluid motion and strode to his son, gathering the boy into his arms with a tenderness that completely transformed his fierce warrior's demeanor. Father and son spoke rapidly in their own language, Running Deer gesturing toward Jake repeatedly, his voice earnest and insistent. Jake stood perfectly still surrounded by wary warriors, knowing that the next few minutes would determine whether he lived or died. Finally, Soaring Eagle released his son and turned back to Jake, his expression still unreadable. He walked slowly toward the cowboy, and Jake forced himself not to step back, not to show fear, though every instinct screamed at him to run. The war chief stopped less than 2 feet away and spoke in careful, measured English. "My son, he tell me you save his life. You protect him from bad men. You care for him like father." His eyes bore into Jake's. "He tell me you share food when you have little. You keep watch all night so he can sleep. You treat his wounds, speak to him with respect." Soaring Eagle paused. And something shifted in his expression, not softening exactly, but a recognition of something important. Running deer say you are man of honor, man with good heart, even though you are white. Jake didn't know what to say, so he simply nodded, acknowledging the compliment while recognizing the complexity behind it, the years of betrayal and broken treaties that made, even though you are white, necessary. What happened next would become a story told around campfires and in frontier saloons for years to come. Soaring Eagle placed his right hand over his heart, then extended it toward Jake, a gesture of respect and acknowledgement. Then he turned to his warriors and spoke in commanding Comanche. The response was immediate warriors who moments ago had been ready to kill. Jake now looked at him with something approaching respect. Soaring Eagle turned back to Jake and spoke words that would change the trajectory of both their lives. You saved my son. You show honor when you could choose to look away. This debt cannot be repaid with words alone. From this moment, you are under protection of the Numanu. You are friend to Soaring Eagle and his people. Any who harm you, harm me. Any who show you disrespect, disrespect my family. Jake felt the weight of those words settle over him like a cloak. He'd thought saving Running Deer might prevent a war, but he hadn't expected this to be formally declared a friend and protected person of the Comanche. It was an honor, certainly, but also a complication he hadn't anticipated. Among frontier whites, such a declaration would mark him as a traitor, a Comanche sympathizer, someone to be distrusted or worse. But looking at Running Deer's grateful face and Soaring Eagle's dignified bearing, Jake found he didn't care. He'd made the right choice, and he'd stand by it regardless of the consequences. Soaring Eagle then did something that took Jake completely by surprise. He called out to his warriors, and within minutes they had efficiently dismantled Jake's makeshift camp and were preparing to transport Running Deer back to their main encampment. But rather than sending Jake on his way, Soaring Eagle gestured for him to mount his horse and join them. You come with us, the war chief said. It wasn't quite a request, but it wasn't exactly an order either. My people need to see the white man who showed honor. My wife, she need to thank the man who bring her son back alive. You come, you eat with us, you see how Numanu live. Then, if you wish, you go with our blessing and our protection. Jake realized he'd just been invited into the heart of Comanche territory, to a camp that few white men had ever seen and lived to tell about. It was dangerous. Certainly, there would be people there who had suffered at the hands of whites and might not share Soaring Eagle's willingness to accept Jake's presence. But it was also an extraordinary opportunity, a chance to see a world that was rapidly disappearing, to understand people who were usually encountered only as enemies. And perhaps most importantly, it was a chance to ensure that Running Deer truly recovered, to see his mission through to completion. I'd be honored, Jake said simply, and he meant it. The journey to the Comanche encampment took most of the day, traveling through terrain that Jake would have sworn was impassable for a large group, but which the warriors navigated with effortless skill. Running Deer rode double with his father, resting against Soaring Eagle's broad back, while Jake found himself surrounded by warriors who alternated between curious observation and wary watchfulness. Some seemed accepting of his presence, particularly after Running Deer would occasionally call out to them in Comanche, apparently explaining what had happened. Others remained clearly suspicious, their hands never far from their weapons, their eyes constantly tracking Jake's every movement. As they traveled, Jake had time to observe the warriors more closely and was struck by how different they were from the savage caricatures depicted in frontier newspapers and dime novels. These were disciplined, skilled fighters, certainly, but they were also men who joked with each other, who showed concern for Running Deer's welfare, who demonstrated a deep knowledge of and respect for the land they moved through. One young warrior, who introduced himself as Swift Horse in broken English, rode beside Jake for part of the journey, and attempted conversation, asking questions about where Jake came from, whether he had family, what he thought of the Nimanu. The exchange was halting and often comical, with both men struggling to bridge the language barrier. But there was genuine curiosity and a tentative friendliness that surprised Jake. As afternoon stretched toward evening, they crested a rise, and Jake got his first view of the Comanche encampment spread out in a valley below. It was larger than he'd expected, at least 60 tipis arranged in loose clusters, with horse herds grazing nearby and the smoke of cook fires rising into the clear air. Children played between the dwellings, women worked at various tasks, and the whole scene had an air of organized community that contradicted every assumption Jake had absorbed about savage nomadic tribes. This was a civilization, complete and functional, with its own structures, rules, and rhythms. Their approach was noticed immediately, and by the time the war party descended into the camp, it seemed like the entire population had turned out to see what was happening. The reaction to Running Deer's return was immediate, and emotional women cried out with joy. Children ran alongside the horses, and older men nodded with visible relief. But the reaction to Jake's presence was decidedly mixed. Some looked at him with open hostility, spitting on the ground as he passed. Others seemed merely curious, studying this white man who had somehow earned the war chief's protection. And a few, particularly the elders, watched him with calculating expressions, as if trying to determine what his presence here might mean for their people's future. Soaring Eagle led the party to the largest tipi in the camp, positioned centrally and decorated with elaborate paintings of horses and buffalo. Before they'd even dismounted, a woman emerged from the dwelling, and Jake knew immediately this must be Bright Cloud, Running Deer's stepmother and Soaring Eagle's wife. She was younger than the chief by perhaps 15 years, beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with frontier standards and everything to do with strength and grace. Her eyes found Running Deer immediately, and she rushed forward with a cry that needed no translation, gathering the boy into her arms, despite his protest that he was too old for such mothering. Then her eyes found Jake, and her expression transformed to something complex: gratitude, certainly, but also wariness and something that might have been fear. She spoke rapidly to Soaring Eagle, her tone questioning, and the chief responded at length, his hand on her shoulder in a gesture that seemed meant to reassure. Finally, she approached Jake where he still sat on his horse, uncertain whether he should dismount without permission. She looked up at him for a long moment, then spoke in Comanche. Running Deer, still weak but determined to translate, explained, "My mother says, she says you give her back her heart. She says she sees kindness in your eyes. She says you are welcome in her home." Jake dismounted and, not knowing what else to do, simply bowed his head in respect. Bright Cloud reached out and touched his arm briefly, a gesture of acceptance, then turned back to fuss over Running Deer, calling for the camp's medicine woman to examine his wounds properly. What followed was an evening unlike any Jake had experienced. Soaring Eagle insisted that Jake join the family for the evening meal, and Jake found himself sitting in the chief's tipi, surrounded by Running Deer's extended family, Bright Cloud, 2 younger children who were Running Deer's half-siblings, an elderly woman who was Soaring Eagle's mother, and several uncles and cousins. The conversation flowed around him in Comanche, with Running Deer occasionally translating key points, and Jake tried to make himself as unobtrusive as possible while observing everything with fascination. The meal itself was simple but nourishing roasted meat that Jake didn't ask too many questions about, some kind of corn preparation, and a stew made with prairie turnips and other ingredients he couldn't identify. As they ate, Running Deer told the full story of his rescue, and Jake watched the family's expressions shift from horror at the attack to gratitude at his intervention. The elderly woman, whose name was Silver Rain, studied Jake throughout the meal with eyes that seemed to see past surface appearances to something deeper. Finally, she spoke directly to him in surprisingly good English, her voice carrying the weight of many years. "You puzzle my mind, white man," she said. "In all my years, I have seen much of your people. Mostly I have seen cruelty, broken promises, greed for land that is not theirs. But sometimes double quotes, she paused, choosing her words carefully. Sometimes I see something else. Men who remember what it means to be human, who do not let the color of skin blind them to what is right. She leaned forward slightly. My grandson tells me you lost a daughter, that she is far away and you miss her. When you saw a running deer bleeding in the dust, maybe you saw your own child. Maybe that is what made you stop when others would ride past. Jake felt his throat tighten with emotion. Maybe so, he admitted quietly. I'd like to think I would have helped regardless, but yes, I saw a child in pain and I couldn't leave him. Same as I'd hoped someone would do for Sarah if she needed help. Silver Rain nodded slowly. This is good hard. But it will make your life hard, I think. Your people, they will not understand. They will call you traitor for showing Numanu respect. And my people double quotes. She glanced around the tipi. Some will not trust you, no matter what you do. They have learned from pain that white man's kindness today becomes white man's betrayal tomorrow. The truth of her words settled heavily in the tipi. Soaring Eagle, who had been listening quietly, finally spoke. Silver Rain speaks wisdom. You have done great honor, Jake Morrison. You have earned respect of this family, protection of this tribe. But the world outside this camp, it does not care about honor between Numanu and white man. It cares only about taking what it wants. He paused, his expression grave. War is coming. Not because we want it, but because we are being pushed from last of our lands. Buffalo are being killed by thousands, not for food, but to starve us. Our children are taken to schools where they are beaten for speaking our language. Treaties are made and broken like dry grass and wind. Jake listened, hearing the frustration and resignation in the war chief's voice. I've seen it, he said quietly. I've seen the injustice. I don't pretend to have answers, but I know what's happening isn't right. Right, wrong, Soaring Eagle said with a bitter laugh. These words mean nothing when one side has more guns, more soldiers, more power to decide what is true. He looked at his son, his expression softening. But today, one man chose honor over convenience. One man reminded me that not all whites have stones where their hearts should be. This is worth remembering, even in dark times ahead. The conversation shifted to other topics, running deer's recovery, preparations for the upcoming buffalo hunt, news from other bands, and Jake found himself gradually relaxing into the unfamiliar setting. The family treated him not as a curiosity or a threat, but simply as a guest, and there was something profoundly moving about this acceptance. Here, in a Comanche tipi in the middle of hostile territory, surrounded by people who had every reason to hate him on sight, Jake felt more welcomed than he had in most frontier towns populated by his own kind. As the evening wore on and the younger children were sent to bed, Soaring Eagle told Jake about the recent history of his band, the forced relocations, the failed attempts at farming on land that couldn't support agriculture, the starvation winters when government supplies promised by treaty never arrived. He spoke without anger, just a weary sadness of a leader watching his people's way of life systematically destroyed. In one generation, he said, we have gone from masters of the plains to beggars asking for scraps at reservation gates. My father would not recognize the world we live in now. And my son D. He looked at Running Deer, who had fallen asleep against his stepmother's shoulder. What world will he inherit? What stories will he have to pass to his children? Jake had no answer to offer, no words of comfort that wouldn't ring hollow. So he simply listened, bearing witness to this man's pain and his determination to preserve what he could of his people's dignity and identity. It was the least he could do, and perhaps, in that moment, the most important thing he could offer, the acknowledgement that these stories mattered, that this loss was real and significant, that the Comanche were not obstacles to be cleared away, but human beings whose suffering and resilience deserved to be recognized. Finally, as the fire burned low and exhaustion began to claim them all, Soaring Eagle showed Jake to a small tipi that had been prepared for him, a gesture of hospitality that again emphasized his status as an honored guest rather than a prisoner or a mere tolerated presence. "Tomorrow," the war chief said, "you will see more of our camp, meet more of our people. Some will be happy you are here, some will not. I ask only that you show respect and patience. We are people who have learned to be suspicious with good reason." "I understand," Jake said, "and I'm grateful for your trust. It's more than I expected or probably deserve." Soaring Eagle gripped his shoulder briefly, a gesture that seemed to carry the weight of something deeper than simple friendship. "You gave me back my son," he said simply. "That is a debt that cannot be repaid, only honored." Then he was gone into the darkness, leaving Jake alone with his thoughts in a Comanche tipi under a vast expanse of stars. Jake lay awake for a long time that night, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the camp, the soft conversations in Comanche, the whinny of horses, the distant yip of coyotes, the rustle of wind through the tipi walls. He thought about the strange turn his life had taken, how a simple act of compassion had led him into the heart of a world he never expected to see. He thought about Sarah, wondering if she would be proud or horrified if she could see him now. He thought about the future, uncertain and threatening, and about the role he might play in the conflicts to come. But mostly as sleep finally claimed him, Jake thought about the moment when Soaring Eagle had called him a man of honor, when Running Deer had looked at him with trust and gratitude, when Bright Cloud had touched his arm in acceptance. These small human connections, these moments of recognition across vast cultural divides, they might not change the trajectory of history, might not stop the terrible forces already in motion, but they mattered. They had to matter. Because if they didn't, if there was no room in this harsh world for simple human decency to bridge the gaps between different peoples, then the darkness ahead was darker than Jake could bear to imagine. Jake woke to the sounds of a camp coming to life, women calling to children, the stamping of horses, the crackle of fires being rebuilt, and the rhythmic sound of someone pounding something in a steady beat. Morning light filtered through the tipi walls, soft and golden, and for a disorienting moment, Jake forgot where he was. Then memory rushed back the Comanche camp, Running Deer, his impossible situation as a white man living among people his own kind considered enemies. When he emerged from the tipi, he found Swift Horse waiting for him with a bowl of some kind of corn porridge and a slightly awkward smile. "Soaring Eagle says I show you camp," the young warrior said in his limited English. "You see how Nimwanu live. Then tonight, there is ... He struggled for the word, then made a gesture that Jake interpreted as some kind of ceremony or gathering. The morning that followed was an education unlike any Jake had received in his 43 years. Swift Horse led him through the camp, introducing him to various people and showing him aspects of Comanche life with obvious pride. They watched women expertly tanning buffalo hides, transforming raw material into soft, workable leather with techniques passed down through countless generations. They observed craftsmen making arrows with precision that put factory production to shame, each one individually balanced and tested. They saw children learning to ride horses, some barely old enough to walk, managing to stay mounted on gentle maris, already developing the legendary riding skills that made Comanche warriors so formidable. But it was the people themselves who most impressed and surprised Jake. He met Morning Star, a woman who had lost her husband and 2 sons in a cavalry raid, who had every reason to hate all white men, but who offered Jake a cautious nod of acknowledgement when Swift Horse explained his role in saving Running Deer. He spoke with 3 bears, an older warrior who had fought in dozens of battles and who studied Jake with calculating eyes before asking, in perfect English, questions about army movements and settler intentions, clearly assessing whether Jake might be useful as a source of information about the enemy. He encountered Stone Fist, a young warrior whose brother had been killed by buffalo hunters just weeks ago, who made no attempt to hide his contempt for Jake's presence and who loudly questioned why Soaring Eagle would invite a white man into their camp. Swift Horse hurried Jake away from that confrontation, but not before Jake saw the pain and rage in Stone Fist's eyes and understood that his grief was entirely justified. Jake was walking among people who had suffered terrible losses at the hands of men who looked like him, spoke like him, shared his skin color. The fact that he personally hadn't committed those crimes didn't erase the reality of their pain. Around midday, Silver Rain found him and gestured for him to follow her to the medicine tipi where Running Deer was being examined by the tribe's healer, an ancient woman named Healing Hands, whose face was a map of wrinkles and whose eyes were surprisingly sharp and bright. She was changing Running Deer's bandages with expert efficiency, muttering to herself in Comanche as she worked. When she saw Jake, she fixed him with a penetrating stare and spoke rapidly to Silver Rain, who translated with a slight smile. She says you did good work for a man with no training. The wounds were cleaned properly. The bleeding stopped correctly. She says maybe you have healing spirit inside you that you don't know about. Silver Rain paused, then added her own observation. Among our people, those who show gift for healing are considered special. It is sacred work to help others survive. That you did this for a child not your own, of people not your own. This is a powerful thing. Jake felt uncomfortable with the praise. I just did what anyone should do, he muttered. But most don't, Silver Rain replied gently. That is the difference between should and do. You chose do. Running Deer, looking much better with proper care and rest, grinned at Jake and said something in Comanche that made both Silver Rain and Healing Hands laugh. He says you are terrible at making bandages, but you have gentle hands for a rough-looking white man. Silver Rain translated, her eyes twinkling. Despite the tension and uncertainty of his situation, Jake found himself laughing too. The moment felt almost normal, almost like being part of a community rather than an outsider under suspicious observation. But such moments were fragile, and Jake was reminded of that when Soaring Eagle appeared at the tipi entrance, his expression serious. Come, the war chief said to Jake. Council of Elders wishes to speak with you. They have heard of what you did, and they have questions. There was something in his tone that suggested this was not going to be a comfortable conversation. The council met in a large tipi at the center of the camp, and Jake found himself facing 7 elders, 5 men and 2 women, whose combined age probably exceeded 400 years and whose collective wisdom and experience were evident in their bearing. Soaring Eagle sat to one side, present but not leading, his role here that of war chief rather than primary decision-maker. The oldest man, whose name Jake learned was Painted Sky, spoke first through an interpreter since his English was limited. White man, you have done service to our war chief's family. For this, you have our gratitude. But your presence here raises difficult questions. Painted Sky's voice was reedy with age, but carried unmistakable authority. You have seen our camp, our people, our ways. You know where we are, how many warriors we have, what our strengths and weaknesses might be. When you leave here and return to your people, what will you tell them? Will you lead soldiers to us? Will you sell this information for gold or favor? The question was blunt and entirely fair. Jake met the old man's eyes and spoke carefully. I understand your concern. I know that trust between your people and mine is broken, maybe beyond repair. I can't prove my intentions with words. Words are cheap. And I am sure you've heard a lot of pretty words from white men that turned out to be lies. He paused, organizing his thoughts. All I can tell you is this. I'm a nobody. I'm a drifter with no connections, no influence, no reason for soldiers or settlers to listen to anything I say. Even if I wanted to cause harm, which I don't, I couldn't do much damage. And more than that, What I've seen here today isn't what I expected. I've seen families, children learning and playing, people working together and caring for each other. I've seen a civilization, not savagery. And I've been treated with more kindness and hospitality here than in most white settlements I've passed through. Another elder, a woman named Wise Owl, spoke up. Pretty words, she said in excellent English. But words are wind. How do we know your heart matches your tongue? You don't, Jake admitted. You can't. That's the nature of trust. It requires a leap of faith. But I'll say this. Running Deer trusted me when he had no reason to. Soaring Eagle trusted me enough to bring me here. Maybe that should count for something. The council members conferred among themselves in rapid Comanche, their expressions hard to read. Finally, Painted Sky spoke again. Soaring Eagle has declared you friend to our people, under our protection. This is his right as war chief, and we respect his judgment. But we say this to you, white man. If you betray this trust, if you bring harm to our people through your actions, there is no place on this earth you can hide where our warriors will not find you. Do you understand this? I do, Jake said quietly, and I accept it. Another elder, a scarred warrior named Black Shield, leaned forward. There is something else. You are caught between two worlds now. Your people will see you as traitor for coming here, for showing us respect. Our people, many will never fully trust you because of what others like you have done. You have made yourself outcast by choosing honor. Was it worth it? The question struck at the heart of Jake's internal struggle. He thought about his old life, lonely, purposeless, drifting from job to job with no connection to anything larger than his own survival. Then he thought about the last few days, terrifying, yes, but also meaningful in a way he hadn't experienced in years. Yes, he said finally. It was worth it. It is worth it. Black Shield nodded slowly, something like respect flickering across his weathered face. Then perhaps you are what Running Deer claims a man who stands against the wind. He used the Comanche phrase that Jake had been given as a name, and hearing it from this battle-scarred elder gave it a weight it hadn't had before. The council talked among themselves for several more minutes. Then Painted Sky addressed Jake again. The council has decided. You may stay among us for 7 days, until Running Deer is strong enough for you to travel together back toward White Lands. During this time, you will be our guest and under our protection. You will learn our ways, see our lives, understand what it is you helped to preserve by saving our chief's son. And then you will go back to your world, carrying with you the truth of what you have seen. If you speak of us to others, speak truth, that we are human beings, not monsters, that we love our children, honor our elders, and fight only because we are being destroyed. Can you do this? I can, Jake said. I will. Then it is settled. Painted Sky made a gesture of dismissal, then paused and added, Tonight we honor those we have lost in recent moons. It is sacred ceremony, not usually witnessed by outsiders. But Soaring Eagle wishes you to see it, to understand the cost of this conflict on our people. You are welcome to attend, if you wish. That evening, as the sun set in spectacular colors across the western sky, the entire camp gathered in a large clearing. A massive bonfire was built, and drums began a slow, mournful beat that seemed to resonate in Jake's chest. He sat with Swift Horse on the periphery of the gathering, watching as people stepped forward, one by one, to speak the names of those they had lost, to war, to disease, to the countless ways that death came to a people being systematically erased from their homeland. The grief was palpable, overwhelming in its collective weight. Women wept openly as they spoke of children taken by smallpox or whooping cough diseases brought by white settlers. Men with faces like stone recited the names of brothers, fathers, sons killed in battles or murdered by buffalo hunters in cavalry raids. Elders mourned the passing of ancient traditions that were being lost as the old ways became impossible to maintain. And through it all, the drums beat their steady rhythm, and voices rose in songs that needed no translation to convey their sorrow. When Soaring Eagle stepped forward to speak, the entire camp fell silent. He spoke in Comanche, his voice carrying across the gathering, and though Jake couldn't understand the words, he could hear the pain and determination in them. Running Deer, sitting nearby with his stepmother, quietly translated for Jake. My father speaks of his first wife, my mother, who died of the white man's diseases. He speaks of his brother, killed 5 winters ago by settlers who wanted his horse. He speaks of Gray Wolf, my cousin, murdered 3 days past by men who saw us as targets, not people. And he speaks of all those we have lost, all those who will never see their children grow, never feel the sun on their faces, never ride across the plains in freedom. Then Soaring Eagle said something that made Running Deer catch his breath. The boy translated, his voice barely above a whisper. And my father says, he says that in the midst of all this death and loss, one white man chose life. One man saw a dying boy and decided he mattered more than fear, more than prejudice, more than the safe choice to look away. He says this gives him hope that maybe somewhere in the darkness ahead, there might be light. That maybe not all is lost if such men exist. Jake felt tears burning his eyes, tears for the terrible losses this community had suffered, tears for the injustice and cruelty that had been inflicted upon them, tears for the recognition that he had somehow become a symbol of hope in a situation that seemed hopeless. It was too much weight to carry, too much meaning to attach to one simple act. But as he looked around at the faces, illuminated by firelight faces, marked by grief but not broken by it, determined to remember and honor their dead, while still finding reasons to go on, Jake understood that he hadn't just saved Running Deer's life. He'd reminded these people that individual acts of decency still mattered, that not every white man was an enemy, that the world hadn't completely descended into darkness. The ceremony continued late into the night, with dancing and singing that gradually shifted from mourning to celebration, a defiant assertion of life in the face of death, of continuity in the face of destruction. And Jake sat among them, no longer quite an outsider, but not fully one of them either, occupying that liminal space between worlds where he would probably spend the rest of his life. The 7 days Jake spent in the Comanche camp passed with a strange mixture of routine and constant discovery. Each morning, he woke to the sounds of camp life and spent his days learning skills and observing customs that gave him a window into a civilization that most of his contemporaries would never see or understand. Swift Horse became something like a friend, teaching him basic Comanche phrases and patiently correcting his terrible pronunciation. Running Deer recovered rapidly under Healing Hand's expert care, and Jake found himself becoming almost a member of the boy's extended family, sharing meals in Soaring Eagle, tipi, and gradually being accepted by the younger children who initially had been frightened of him. But Jake was also aware that his presence remained controversial. Stonefist continued to glare at him whenever their paths crossed, and Jake occasionally overheard heated discussions in Comanche that seemed to be about him, though he couldn't understand enough to know what was being said. Soaring Eagle told him frankly that some in the camp saw him as a potential threat, someone who might betray them despite his apparent good intentions, while others simply resented the presence of any white man given what they had suffered. Do not take it personally, the war chief advised. They are protecting themselves, protecting our people, the only way they know how. On the 5th day, 3 bears approached Jake with a request that surprised him. The old warrior wanted to know about the army's tactics, their numbers, their weapons. I do not ask you to betray your people, 3 bears said carefully, but we must understand what we face. Many of us have fought soldiers, but the world changes quickly now. New guns, new ways of war. If you can help us understand, maybe we survive longer, protect our families better. It was a delicate ethical question. Jake had no particular loyalty to the army. He'd never served. had no love for the institution that was enforcing the government's policies against indigenous peoples. But providing tactical information could lead to deaths, could make him directly complicit in future conflicts. He thought about it carefully before responding. I'll tell you what any civilian would know, what's not secret. I won't give you information that would require me to have been a soldier to know. Fair? Three Bears considered this, then nodded. Fair. The conversation that followed was illuminating for both of them. Jake shared observations about Army supply lines, typical patrol patterns, the kinds of weapons that were becoming standard issue. Three Bears, in turn, explained Comanche warfare tactics, the hit-and-run raids, the use of terrain, the coordination between mounted warriors that made them such effective fighters. It was a strange exchange of knowledge between potential enemies, but it was also a recognition of mutual respect. Both men understood that they were on opposite sides of a conflict that neither had started, trying to protect their own in a world that had become unnecessarily cruel. On the evening of the sixth day, Soaring Eagle invited Jake to join him and several other leaders for a private council. They sat around a small fire in the war chief's tipi, and Soaring Eagle spoke with unusual directness. Tomorrow you leave. Return to white man's world. Before you go, there are things I wish to say. He paused, gathering his thoughts. What has happened here, with you and Running Deer? It is small thing in big conflict. One boy saved, one white man shown hospitality. These do not change the fact that my people are dying, that our way of life is ending. But sometimes, small things matter more than big things. Sometimes, one person choosing honor reminds us why we fight, why we survive, what we are trying to preserve. He looked around at the other men present, Black Shield, Three Bears, and several others, and continued. You have seen us as we are, not as white men say we are. You know now that we are not savages to be exterminated, but people with families, traditions, beliefs that matter to us. When you return to your world, some will call you Indian lover, traitor, fool. But I ask you this, remember what you have seen. Speak truth when you can. And if time comes when you can help, even in small way, please do so. This is all I ask, that you remain man who stands against wind, who chooses right thing even when it is hard thing. Jake felt the weight of this request, understanding that Soaring Eagle was asking him to be more than just a friend to one family, but a potential advocate or ally in whatever struggles lay ahead. I'll do what I can, Jake promised. I can't promise it'll amount to much. I'm nobody important, but I'll try. Black Shield spoke up, his voice gruff. Maybe being nobody is advantage. Nobody important has nothing to lose by speaking truth. Man with reputation, position, wealth, these are chains that keep him silent. But you are free to be honest. That night, the camp held a farewell feast for Jake, a gesture of respect that seemed excessive given how short his time with them had been, but which clearly meant a great deal to many people. Gifts were presented, a beautiful beaded belt from Bright Cloud, a finely crafted knife from Three Bears, a pair of moccasins from Silver Rain that she insisted would last longer than any white man's boots. Running Deer gave him the most precious gift of all, one of the eagle feathers from his necklace, which the boy solemnly explained represented courage and honor. So you remember, Running Deer said in English that had improved remarkably over the week. So you remember that one Numair boy thinks you are a good man, even if rest of the world disagrees. Jake accepted each gift with genuine gratitude and growing emotion, understanding that these were not just objects, but symbols of acceptance, respect, and the relationships he had formed. When it came time for him to speak, he found himself struggling to express what the experience had meant to him. I came here by accident, he said, with Swift Horse translating for those who didn't understand English. I found a boy who needed help, and I did what I thought was right. I didn't expect anything in return, certainly didn't expect to be welcomed into your homes, your lives. These past days, You've shown me a world I never knew existed, and you've treated me with more kindness than I probably deserved. I know that war is coming. The dark times are ahead for all of us. I know I can't stop it, probably can't even slow it down. But I promise you this, I'll remember what I've seen here. I'll remember that the Comanche are not the monsters that frontier newspapers describe, but human beings with dignity, with culture, with every right to defend their homes and families. And if I ever have a chance to help, even in some small way, I will. The feast continued late into the night, with storytelling and singing that gradually transitioned from formal to celebratory. Jake found himself laughing at jokes he only partially understood, attempting to join in songs whose words he couldn't pronounce, and feeling a sense of belonging that had eluded him for years. It was bittersweet knowing this would end tomorrow, that he would leave this place and likely never return, that these connections would be severed by the realities of a world that couldn't accommodate friendship between a white cowboy and a Comanche tribe. The next morning came too quickly. Jake woke early, unpacked his few belongings, then found Running Deer waiting for him outside his tipi. The boy was fully recovered now, standing straight and strong, the wounds that had nearly killed him reduced to angry red scars that would fade with time. "I want to ride with you," Running Deer said. "Part of the way. My father says it is proper, that I should honor the man who saved my life by accompanying him back toward his world." Soaring Eagle and about 20 warriors were mounted and ready to escort them to the edge of Comanche territory. It was both an honor guard and a practical precaution. There were bands of buffalo hunters and settlers who would attack Comanche on sight, and the warriors would ensure that Jake and Running Deer made it safely to neutral ground. The farewell to the camp was emotional, with Bright Cloud embracing Jake like a son, and Silver Rain giving him her blessing in a mixture of Comanche and English that he did not fully understand, but whose meaning was clear. "Go safely, live well, remember us." The ride took most of the day, crossing terrain that looked empty to Jake's eyes, but which the Comanche navigated with intimate knowledge of every water source, every landmark, every potential danger. They rode in comfortable silence for long stretches, but occasionally, Running Deer would point out something significant, a place where his grandfather had won a famous battle, a valley where the buffalo used to gather in herds so large they blackened the earth, a spring that was sacred to his people for reasons that went back to the time the 4 white men arrived. As afternoon shadows lengthened, they reached a spot that Soaring Eagle designated as the boundary, a rocky outcropping that overlooked miles of rolling plains. Beyond this point, Jake would be back in the world he knew, and the warriors would turn back to their camp. The parting was brief but meaningful. Soaring Eagle gripped Jake's arm in the way he had during their first encounter, his eyes conveying messages that transcended language. "Ride safe, friend," he said simply. "May your path be clear and your enemies blind." Running Deer embraced Jake fiercely, tears streaming down his young face despite his attempts to maintain stoic composure. "I won't forget," he said. "When I am old, when I have children of my own, I will tell them about the white man who saved my life, who showed me that not all are enemies. Your name will be remembered among my people, Jake Morrison. This I promise." Then the Comanche warriors were riding away, becoming smaller and smaller until they disappeared into the landscape from which they seemed inseparable. Jake sat his horse for a long time, watching them go, feeling the weight of the eagle feather in his pocket and the strange emptiness that came with leaving behind something important. 3 weeks later, Jake found himself in a saloon in a small town called Redemption, nursing a whiskey and trying to blend into the background as he always had. But something had changed. He could feel it in himself, a subtle shift in how he saw the world and his place in it. When 2 drifters at the bar started talking loudly about the Indian problem and how the only good one was a dead one, Jake found himself standing up, his chair scraping loudly across the floor. "You ever actually met any Comanche?" Jake asked, his voice cutting through the saloon noise. Or do you just repeat what you hear from other fools who don't know what they were talking about? The larger of the two drifters turned, his expression hostile. What's it to you, old man? You some kind of Indian lover? Jake thought about running deer's trusting eyes, about soaring eagle's dignified bearing, about silver rain's wisdom and bright cloud's gentle strength. He thought about the gifts he carried and the promises he'd made. Yeah, he said quietly. I guess I am. And let me tell you what I learned from spending time with those savages. You were so eager to wipe out ... double quotes. What followed was a fight. Jake took a beating from men who couldn't tolerate hearing truth that contradicted their prejudices. But he also planted seeds of doubt in some of the listeners, made a few people reconsider their assumptions, spoke truth in a place where lies had been comfortable. It wasn't much, but it was something. It was keeping his promise. The years that followed were hard ones, as Black Shield had predicted. Jake found it difficult to find steady work because word spread that he was sympathetic to Indigenous peoples. He was spat on in some towns, threatened in others, and more than once barely escaped with his life when his views became known. But he kept speaking truth when he could, kept standing against the wind of popular opinion, kept refusing to accept the narrative that dehumanized an entire people. He never saw Running Deer or Soaring Eagle or the Comanche camp again. By the time he tried to return a year later, they had moved on, driven further from their traditional lands by army pressure and settler encroachment. But he heard stories sometimes, fragments of news about a war chief who fought with brilliant tactics and a son who was said to ride like the wind itself. And whenever he heard those stories, Jake would touch the eagle feather he always carried, remembering a time when he had made a choice that mattered, when he had been more than just another drifter trying to survive. In 1874, Jake read in a newspaper about the Red River War and learned that many Comanche bands, including Soaring Eagles, had been forced onto reservations in Oklahoma Territory. The news hit him like a physical blow, knowing that the vibrant community he'd seen was now confined, controlled. Their way of life officially ended. He considered trying to find them, but practical reality held him back. He was aging, poor, and probably wouldn't be allowed onto the reservation anyway. But in 1876, something extraordinary happened. Jake was working a ranch outside of Fort Worth when a young Comanche man appeared one day, asking specifically for Jake Morrison by name. It was Swift Horse, older and wearing the clothes of reservation life, but still recognizably the friendly warrior who had shown Jake around the camp years ago. He carried a message from Soaring Eagle. The war chief remembers the man who saved his son. He says to tell you that Running Deer lives, that he is married, and has a son of his own. The child is named Stands Against Wind, in your honor. Soaring Eagle says you will always be friend to his family, across all the years and all the changes that come. He says your choice to show honor when you could have chosen convenience changed one boy's life, and that boy will carry forward what you taught him about human decency, crossing all boundaries. Jake wept when he heard this, overcome by the knowledge that his actions had rippled forward in ways he'd never imagined, that somewhere a child bore a name inspired by his choice to stop and help a wounded boy in the dust. It wasn't much in the grand scheme of things. It hadn't stopped the violence, hadn't prevented the devastating losses that Indigenous people suffered, hadn't changed the trajectory of history. But it had mattered to one family, and through them to others, and perhaps that was enough. When Jake Morrison died in 1881 at the age of 52, worn out by hard living and the wounds he'd accumulated from speaking uncomfortable truths, he was buried in a pauper's grave with no marker. But 3 Comanche men attended his funeral in secret, and they left an eagle feather on his grave, a gesture of respect from people who had lost almost everything but had never forgotten. The white man who chose honor when it cost him everything and gained him nothing except the knowledge that he had done what was right. The story of Jake Morrison and Running Deer became legend in some circles, dismissed as sentimentalized fiction in others. But for those who knew the truth, the descendants of running deer, who carried forward the story. The few written accounts that survived from people who had known Jake, it remained a testament to a simple but profound truth, that individual acts of compassion and courage matter even in the darkest times. That choosing to see the humanity in those deemed other is never wasted effort. That standing against the wind, refusing to let prejudice and fear dictate one's choices, is the most important kind of heroism, quiet, unglamorous, often unrewarded, but absolutely essential. And somewhere in Oklahoma, generations later, descendants of running deer still tell the story of the poor cowboy who saved a Comanche boy and became a friend to a people that history tried to erase, proving that the bonds of human decency are stronger than the divisions of race, stronger than the hatreds of conquest, stronger even than the passage of time. The story endures as a reminder that we always have a choice to look away or to help, to see enemies or to see fellow human beings, to choose convenience or to choose honor. And that choice, made again and again by ordinary people in extraordinary moments, is what ultimately defines us as human.